In the serene neighborhood of Misato, Japan, where the days passed with the tranquility of a small town, an event so horrific occurred that it would forever darken the nation's memory. This is the story of Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old high school student whose life was brutally taken in a way that defies belief. Junko was a typical teenager full of life, aspirations, and a bright future ahead of her. But in November 1988, her path crossed with pure evil, leading to a sequence of events so gruesome that they would send shockwaves across the entire country. The story of her abduction and the unimaginable suffering she endured at the hands of four teenage boys would become one of the darkest chapters in modern Japanese history. As we journey into this case, we will uncover details that are both terrifying and deeply tragic. But first, let us pause to remember Junko Furuta, the young girl whose life was stolen by forces so sinister that they still haunt the collective conscience of a nation. It was a day like any other in the life of Junko Furuta. The air was crisp with the onset of winter as she prepared for school, unaware that this day would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Her morning routine was filled with the usual tasks: breakfast with her family, packing her school bag, and heading out the door with a warm goodbye. Little did she know she was stepping into a chain of events that would alter her fate forever. Junko's day was typical, filled with classes, conversations with friends, and thoughts of the weekend ahead. But as the sun began to set, the path she walked every day after school would bring her into the orbit of four young men boys she had no reason to fear, but whose intentions were anything but innocent.
One of the boys, Hiroshi Miyano, had noticed Junko earlier and, with a twisted sense of entitlement, decided she would be his next target. As she walked home, oblivious to the danger lurking nearby, Miyano and his accomplices set their plan in motion. A simple walk home from school would become the moment when the ordinary turned nightmarish, leading Junko into a darkness from which she would never return.
The suspense of that initial encounter hangs heavy, a silent prelude to the horror that would soon follow. Junko's fate was sealed in that fleeting moment, a moment where an ordinary day spiraled into something far more sinister. As the twilight faded into night, Junko Furuta unknowingly walked into a carefully laid trap. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, was no stranger to violence and delinquency. At 18 years old, he was already known in the underworld for his connections to the Yakuza, Japan's notorious criminal syndicate. His three accomplices, Joe Ogura, Nobuharu Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, were similarly troubled, each with a history of petty crimes and a disturbing lack of empathy. Miyano approached Junko under the guise of friendliness, asking if she could help him find his way. Trusting the seemingly harmless request, Junko agreed, not knowing that this small act of kindness would be her undoing. As she walked with Miyano, the other boys lay in wait, hidden from sight but ready to strike. In a sudden and violent turn, Miyano revealed his true intentions. He grabbed Junko, and before she could scream, the others emerged, overpowering her in an instant. Terrified and disoriented, Junko was dragged to a secluded area. The boys had no intention of letting her go. The realization of what was happening must have struck Junko like a lightning bolt. One moment she was on a familiar path, the next she was a captive, surrounded by cold, calculating predators. The fear that gripped her as she struggled to understand the horror of her situation was only the beginning of the nightmare that would soon unfold. Junko Furuta's nightmare began the moment she was taken to a house in the Ayase district of Adachi, Tokyo, a place that would become her prison for the next 44 days. The house belonged to the parents of Nobuharu Minato, one of her captors, who, astonishingly, were complicit in keeping Junko hidden within their home. The basement, dark and suffocating, became the site of unspeakable acts, a space where hope would quickly wither away. In those first few days, Junko's captors unleashed a level of cruelty that defies human understanding. What began with threats and intimidation rapidly escalated into physical violence. They beat her mercilessly, stripping away not just her dignity but her sense of safety and humanity. The brutality was relentless, with no respite from the pain and terror. Her screams for help were ignored, her pleas for mercy met with laughter. As the days dragged on, it became clear that the boys were driven by more than just a desire to harm, they were feeding a perverse need for power and control. Hiroshi Miyano, emboldened by his Yakuza connections, seemed to take the lead, orchestrating the torment with a cold detachment that hinted at deeper, darker impulses. The others, eager to prove their loyalty and assert their own twisted dominance, followed suit, each contributing to the escalating violence. The cruelty was not just physical but psychological. Junko was subjected to degradation and humiliation, stripped of her identity and reduced to a mere object of their sadistic pleasures. The boys' motives were as twisted as their actions. They were not content with just hurting her. They wanted to break her completely, to see the light in her eyes extinguished by their hands. These initial days were just the beginning of the horror that would continue to unfold as Junko's captors delved deeper into their own depravity, pushing the boundaries of cruelty with each passing hour. The brutality inflicted upon Junko Furuta during her captivity is almost beyond comprehension. Over the course of 44 harrowing days, the violence escalated to levels that defy humanity, with each day bringing new forms of torture designed to break her in every conceivable way. The physical torture was relentless and varied, a sickening display of the captor's sadistic creativity. Junko was repeatedly beaten, her body subjected to intense and prolonged physical abuse. Her captors burned her with cigarettes, dripped hot wax on her skin, and even set her on fire with lighter fluid. Her limbs were mutilated, fingers broken, bones crushed as her tormentors sought to destroy her ability to resist, even to move. Her suffering was not limited to physical pain. The boys degraded her in ways that aimed to strip away her humanity. She was starved, denied even basic necessities, and subjected to sexual assaults so frequent and brutal that they left her physically debilitated. Junko's captors forced her to consume her own urine and feces, further eroding her dignity and breaking her spirit. As her condition worsened, her injuries became infected and she was left in a state of unimaginable agony. Junko was trapped in a living nightmare, her body covered in bruises, burns, and open wounds. She could barely move, let alone fight back, and her captors showed no mercy, no signs of relenting. They seemed to revel in her suffering, taking sick pleasure in her pain while she slowly faded away, both physically and emotionally. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Junko's ordeal was the psychological torment she endured. Isolated from the world, she was cut off from any hope of rescue. Her cries for help went unanswered, and each day must have felt like an eternity. The mental anguish of knowing that there was no escape, no relief, was as devastating as the physical pain. Through it all, Junko showed incredible resilience, surviving far longer than her captors likely expected. Yet the cost of that survival was beyond measure. The toll on her body and soul was immense, as every shred of hope was systematically extinguished by her torturers. This 44-day ordeal is a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the unimaginable suffering that one person can endure. Junko's pain, both seen and unseen, speaks to a darkness that most can hardly fathom, a darkness that consumed her completely in the end. Despite the overwhelming brutality she faced, Junko Furuta's will to survive remained strong. In the midst of her agony, there were moments where she mustered the strength and courage to seek escape, clinging to the faint hope that she could somehow break free from the nightmare. However, each attempt was met with devastating consequences. In one instance, when Junko managed to briefly free herself and attempt to flee, her captors quickly caught her. The realization that she had tried to escape enraged the boys, leading them to punish her with even greater cruelty. They beat her savagely, ensuring that she would be physically incapable of attempting another escape. Her already fragile body was further broken, her spirit further crushed under the weight of their wrath. The boys responded to her escape attempts by tightening their control over her. They increased their surveillance, ensuring she was never left alone, and intensified the psychological manipulation, making it clear that any further attempts would be met with even more severe repercussions. The message was clear: there was no way out. The walls of her prison grew thicker, and the hope of rescue grew fainter. This crushing reality took an immense psychological toll on Junko. The repeated failures and the boy's ruthless reactions must have filled her with a deep sense of despair. Each failed attempt to escape wasn't just a physical setback, it was a mental and emotional blow that made the nightmare she was living seem even more inescapable. The psychological torment was relentless. The boys played cruel mind games, giving her false hope one moment only to snatch it away the next. They wanted her to feel utterly powerless, to believe that no one would ever come to save her. This mental warfare, combined with the physical abuse, created a prison not just of walls, but of fear, hopelessness, and despair. The crushing reality for Junko was that she was alone, trapped in a situation that grew more horrifying by the day. Every attempt to escape only deepened her suffering, as her captors tightened their grip and extinguished any remaining hope she might have had. This was a psychological hell where the walls closed in tighter with every passing day, leaving her with the unbearable knowledge that her fate was entirely in the hands of those who relished in her pain. As Junko Furuta endured unimaginable suffering within the walls of that suburban house, a chilling truth loomed over her ordeal. Others knew about her captivity, yet chose to remain silent. This complicity and silence from those who were aware of her plight added an unbearable layer of hopelessness to an already horrific situation. Among those who knew were the parents of Nobuharu Minato, the boy in whose home Junko was held captive. They lived under the same roof, aware of the horrifying acts being committed, yet they did nothing to stop it. Whether out of fear, indifference, or a twisted sense of loyalty to their son, their inaction was a damning betrayal of the basic human decency that could have saved Junko's life. The involvement didn't stop there. Friends and acquaintances of the boys also knew about Junko's imprisonment. Some even participated in her abuse, while others turned a blind eye, choosing not to intervene despite their knowledge of the torture she was enduring. This collective silence created a web of complicity that trapped Junko even further, making escape or rescue an even more distant possibility. The impact of this silence was profound. For Junko, it meant that there was no one to turn to, no hope of salvation. The very people who could have helped her chose instead to ignore her suffering, allowing the nightmare to continue. This indifference to her fate must have deepened her despair, reinforcing the belief that she was utterly alone in her struggle. For society, this collective silence is a haunting reminder of the dangers of apathy. The fact that so many people knew yet did nothing speaks to a broader issue of moral failure and unwillingness to stand up against evil when it is most necessary. The complicity of these bystanders not only prolonged Junko's suffering but also underscored the profound isolation she must have felt, knowing that even those who could have helped chose to remain silent. This silence, this collective turning away from Junko's agony, is perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of her story. It wasn't just the brutality of her captors that sealed her fate, it was also the inaction of those who stood by, watching as a young girl's life was slowly and painfully destroyed. This silence, in its own way, was as cruel and unforgiving as the torture itself, leaving a lasting stain on the conscience of all who knew but did nothing. As the days dragged on, Junko Furuta's condition deteriorated to an almost unrecognizable state. The final days of her captivity were marked by a descent into a darkness so profound that it is difficult to comprehend. The brutality inflicted upon her reached its zenith as her captors, now fully engulfed in their sadistic cruelty, showed no restraint in their relentless assault. Junko's physical condition had worsened to the point where she could barely move. Her body, once vibrant and full of life, was now a shattered shell covered in bruises, burns, and open wounds that festered with infection. The torture had left her disfigured, her limbs broken, and her face swollen beyond recognition. She was in constant, excruciating pain, with injuries so severe that they should have been fatal long before her actual death. Despite her frailty, the boys continued their sadistic acts, showing no mercy as they pushed the boundaries of human cruelty. They beat her with metal rods, burned her flesh, and forced her to endure unimaginable pain. Her captors seemed determined to erase every last vestige of her humanity, reducing her to a state of utter helplessness. In these final days, Junko was subjected to the most inhumane treatment imaginable. She was deprived of food and water, left to starve in a dark, filthy room. Her injuries were untreated, and the infections that raged through her body added another layer of agony to her already unbearable suffering. The pain was unrelenting, and the torture continued without pause as the boys took perverse pleasure in her suffering. As her body weakened, so too did her spirit. The strength that had carried her through those 44 days was slowly extinguished, smothered by the sheer weight of the brutality she endured. Each day was a battle for survival, and each day brought her closer to the end. The light in her eyes dimmed as the darkness closed in, and Junko, once a bright and hopeful young girl, was reduced to a broken, lifeless form. The tragic conclusion of Junko Furuta's life was not a sudden event, but a slow, agonizing descent into death. In the final hours, her captors delivered one last, fatal beating, an act of brutality so severe that her body could no longer endure. Junko's life slipped away in that dark, suffocating room, her death the final, tragic outcome of 44 days of unimaginable horror. As we prepare to confront the full reality of Junko's fate, it is important to remember that her suffering was not just a story, but a real lived experience, a descent into darkness that no one should ever have to endure. This was the ultimate consequence of unchecked cruelty, indifference, and evil, a young life extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. After 44 days of relentless torture, Junko Furuta's suffering finally came to a tragic end. Her captors, realizing that she had succumbed to her injuries, faced the grim reality of what they had done. In a cold, calculated move, they decided to dispose of her body, attempting to cover up the horrific crime they had committed. The boys wrapped Junko's lifeless body in blankets and stuffed it into a large drum. In a final act of cruelty, they filled the drum with concrete, hoping that the weight and the solid mass would conceal their crime forever. With disturbing nonchalance, they transported the drum to a deserted area and dumped it, believing that they had successfully erased any evidence of their unimaginable brutality. But Junko's story did not end there. Despite their efforts to hide the crime, the truth would soon emerge, bringing their horrific acts into the light. The boys' involvement in other crimes had drawn the attention of the police, and in a twist of fate, one of the perpetrators, Hiroshi Miyano, was arrested for an unrelated offense. During the interrogation, a careless remark about Junko's murder led the police to the drum, hidden in an abandoned lot. When the authorities opened the drum, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The discovery of Junko Furuta's body, encased in concrete, sent shockwaves through the investigators and soon through the entire nation. The brutality of the crime was almost too much to comprehend. How could a group of teenage boys commit such an atrocity? The details of the case, once revealed, sparked a public outcry as the nation grappled with the horrifying reality of what had happened to Junko. The shock and horror that followed the discovery were profound. News of the crime spread quickly, and the nation was gripped by the gruesome details that emerged. The sheer cruelty of the boy's actions, combined with the prolonged nature of Junko's suffering, left the public reeling. It was not just the violence that shocked people, but the realization that something so horrific could happen in their society, in their own neighborhoods. As the investigation unfolded, the boys' attempts to cover up their crime only added to the outrage. Their cold blooded efforts to dispose of Junko's body, coupled with their casual attitude toward her death, painted a chilling picture of their complete lack of remorse. The public demanded justice for Junko, and the case became a symbol of the darkest side of human nature, a stark reminder of what can happen when cruelty and indifference go unchecked. The discovery of Junko Furuta's body marked the beginning of a long and painful process of seeking justice, but it also marked the end of her horrific ordeal. Though her life had been stolen in the most brutal way imaginable, the truth of what she endured would not remain hidden. Junko's story, once uncovered, would resonate far beyond the borders of Japan, serving as a haunting reminder of the capacity for evil that exists in the world. The arrest of Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Nobuharu Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe marked the beginning of a legal battle that would grip Japan with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The boys who had committed acts of unspeakable cruelty now faced the weight of the law. As the initial charges were filed kidnapping, rape, and murder, the public was both relieved and anxious. Would justice be served, or would the legal system fail to fully account for the depth of the crime? The media frenzy was immediate and intense. Every detail of the case, every grim revelation was splashed across headlines, igniting a wave of public outrage. People across Japan were horrified not only by the brutality of the crime, but by the age of the perpetrators. How could boys so young commit such atrocities? And would the legal system, with its reputation for leniency toward juveniles, deliver the justice that Junko Furuta deserved? As the trial began, the courtroom became the stage for a national drama. The prosecution laid out the horrific facts, painting a picture of relentless cruelty and unimaginable suffering. They detailed Junko's 44 days of torture, the physical and psychological scars inflicted by her captors, and the cold, calculated attempts to conceal the crime. The defense, however, sought to mitigate the boys' responsibility by focusing on their youth and the supposed influence of a broken society. They argued that the boys were products of their environment, victims of a culture that had failed them. This line of defense only served to enrage the public further. The idea that the boys' actions could be explained away, that their youth could somehow excuse the horror they inflicted, felt like a betrayal of Junko's memory. The courtroom became a battleground not just for the fate of the four boys, but for the soul of Japan's justice system. The public watched with bated breath, fearing that the law might fall short, that the sentences handed down might not reflect the gravity of the crime. The stakes were high not just for Junko's family, who sought justice for their daughter, but for a nation grappling with the darkest aspects of its own society. As the trial unfolded, the tension only grew. Would the legal system rise to the occasion, or would it falter in the face of such overwhelming evil? The outcome of this trial would set a precedent not just in the legal sense, but in the moral conscience of a country that had been deeply scarred by the crime. In the end, the question remained, would justice be served for Junko Furuta, or would her story become a symbol of a legal system that failed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty? The answer, as the trial drew to a close, was anything but certain. The trial of Junko Furuta's murderers quickly became known as the trial of the century, not only for the gruesome nature of the crime, but for the intense public scrutiny that followed every twist and turn of the proceedings. The courtroom became a theater of raw emotion, legal maneuvering, and societal reflection as Japan grappled with the horrifying details that emerged. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution laid out a case so harrowing that it left even the most seasoned observers shaken. They meticulously detailed the 44 days of torture Junko endured, presenting evidence that included graphic descriptions of the abuse, medical reports that chronicled her injuries, and testimonies that painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. The prosecution argued that the premeditated nature of the crime, coupled with the sheer brutality involved, demanded the harshest penalties the law could impose. In stark contrast, the defense sought to downplay the boys' responsibility, employing strategies that infuriated the public. They argued that the boys were victims of their environment, citing their youth, broken homes, and alleged exposure to a culture of violence as mitigating factors. The defense attempted to portray the boys as misguided rather than malicious, suggesting that their actions, while horrific, were a product of societal failure rather than pure evil. This defense strategy, however, backfired spectacularly in the court of public opinion. The public, already seething with anger over the crime, saw the defense's arguments as a gross minimization of Junko's suffering. To many, it felt as though the legal system was more concerned with the welfare of the perpetrators than with delivering justice for the victim. This perception only intensified the outrage, with many calling for harsher punishments and a reevaluation of the juvenile justice system. Throughout the trial, shocking details continued to emerge, each one more appalling than the last. Witnesses recounted the boys' casual indifference to Junko's suffering, their cruel taunts, and their chilling lack of remorse. The court was shown evidence of the boys' attempts to cover up the crime, including the concrete filled drum where they had disposed of her body, further underscoring their calculated ruthlessness. As these details came to light, the emotional toll on Junko's family was profound. Her parents, who had lost their daughter in the most brutal way imaginable, sat through the trial with a dignity that masked their deep anguish. Every revelation was a fresh wound, every defense argument a painful reminder that their daughter's life had been reduced to legal arguments and courtroom theatrics. The family's grief, palpable in the courtroom, resonated with a public that had come to see Junko not just as a victim, but as a symbol of innocence lost. The trial also had a profound impact on the broader public. People across Japan followed the proceedings closely, their anger and sorrow growing with each passing day. The case became a focal point for national debates about the justice system, the treatment of juvenile offenders, and the moral fabric of society itself. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding, it was a national reckoning with the darkest aspects of human nature. As the courtroom drama reached its conclusion, the sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. The nation waited with bated breath to see if justice would be served, if the legal system would rise to the challenge posed by such an unprecedented crime. The outcome of the trial would not only determine the fate of the boys, but would also leave an indelible mark on Japan's legal and moral landscape. In the end, the trial of Junko Furuta's killers was not just a legal battle. It was a profound emotional and societal ordeal, one that revealed the depths of both human cruelty and the collective desire for justice. The courtroom drama, with all its heartbreak and horror, would linger in the public consciousness for years to come, a reminder of the terrible consequences of a system that must balance justice with mercy and the cost of getting it wrong. As the trial of Junko Furuta's killers drew to a close, the nation held its breath, awaiting the final verdicts that would determine the fate of the four boys responsible for her brutal murder. The details of the crime had shocked Japan to its core, and the public's demand for justice was clear. Yet, when the sentences were finally handed down, the reaction was one of widespread disbelief and fury. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, received a sentence of 20 years in prison. Joe Oguro was sentenced to 8 years, Nobuharu Minato to 4 to 6 years, and Yasushi Watanabe to 5 to 7 years. These sentences, though severe for juvenile offenders, were seen by many as a gross miscarriage of justice given the horrific nature of the crime. The sentences were viewed as far too lenient, sparking immediate and intense public outrage. The public's reaction was swift and fierce. Across Japan, people expressed their anger and frustration at what they perceived as a failure of the justice system. For many, the sentences did not reflect the gravity of the crime or the immense suffering that Junko endured. The fact that the perpetrators could potentially be released while still in their 20s or 30s was seen as an affront to her memory and an insult to the values of justice and morality. The media, which had followed the case closely from the beginning, amplified this sentiment with headlines decrying the leniency of the sentences and editorials calling for legal reforms. The criticism extended beyond the specific case, prompting a broader debate about the Japanese legal system, particularly its treatment of juvenile offenders. Many argued that the system was too focused on rehabilitation at the expense of justice, particularly in cases involving extreme violence. Junko's family, who had endured the trial with quiet dignity, was devastated by the outcome. The sentences felt like a second betrayal, first by the boys who took their daughter's life, and now by a legal system that seemed to minimize the severity of the crime. Their grief, compounded by a sense of injustice, resonated with the public that had come to see Junko as a symbol of innocence lost and the need for accountability. The outcry was not limited to Japan. The case gained international attention, with many outside observers similarly condemning the sentences as inadequate. The global coverage of the case further fueled the debate within Japan as people questioned whether their legal system was truly capable of delivering justice in such extreme cases. In response to the public anger, there were calls for changes to the laws governing juvenile offenders, including proposals to lower the age at which juveniles could be tried as adults and to increase the maximum penalties for serious crimes. While some legal reforms were eventually enacted, the legacy of the Furuta case continued to haunt the Japanese legal system for years. The sentencing of Junko Furuta's killers remains one of the most controversial and criticized aspects of the case. For many, it was a stark reminder of the limitations of a legal system that, in its attempt to balance rehabilitation and punishment, sometimes fails to deliver the justice that victims and their families so desperately seek. The widespread anger and frustration that followed the verdicts underscored the profound impact that this case had on Japan, a nation grappling with the darkest aspects of its own society and the challenge of ensuring that justice is truly served. The brutal murder of Junko Furuta sent shockwaves throughout Japan, leaving a profound and lasting impact on the nation's psyche. As the details of her horrific ordeal became known, the entire country was plunged into a state of collective mourning, grappling with the reality that such unimaginable cruelty could exist within its borders. The case became a catalyst for widespread reflection and change as Japan confronted the dark undercurrents of youth crime and violence that had been brought to the forefront. One of the most immediate impacts of Junko's case was the national outcry for justice and reform. The perceived leniency of the sentences handed down to her killers ignited a fierce public debate about the adequacy of Japan's legal system, particularly in dealing with juvenile offenders. The case exposed significant gaps in the way the legal system addressed violent crimes committed by youths, and the public demand for change was impossible to ignore. In response to this outcry, there were significant discussions about reforming Japan's juvenile justice laws. The Furuta case became a focal point for those advocating for stricter penalties for violent crimes committed by minors. While Japan had traditionally emphasized rehabilitation over punishment for juveniles, the brutality of Junko's murder led many to question whether this approach was appropriate in cases of extreme violence. Over time, some legal reforms were enacted, including measures to allow for harsher sentences in particularly egregious cases involving juvenile offenders. Beyond legal reforms, the case also had a profound impact on public awareness and attitudes toward youth crime. Junko's story became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked delinquency and the potential for extreme violence among young people. It sparked a nationwide conversation about the root causes of youth crime, including issues such as bullying, peer pressure, and the influence of organized crime on young delinquents. The case also highlighted the need for better protective measures for young people, particularly girls who might be vulnerable to predatory behavior. In schools and communities across Japan, there was a renewed focus on anti crime measures and education aimed at preventing such tragedies from occurring again. Programs were introduced to address bullying, promote mental health, and educate young people about the consequences of violence. The case also led to increased vigilance among parents, educators, and law enforcement as the nation collectively sought to prevent another tragedy like Junko's from happening. The impact of Junko Furuta's case extended beyond the immediate legal and social changes. It left an indelible mark on the cultural consciousness of Japan, serving as a stark reminder of the fragility of innocence and the horrors that can arise when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. The case became a reference point in discussions about youth violence, and Junko's name became synonymous with the need for justice, protection, and reform. For years after the trial, the memory of Junko Furuta continued to resonate with the Japanese public. Her story was told and retold in the media, in classrooms, and in homes as a cautionary tale of what can happen when the darker aspects of human nature are left unchecked. The case changed the conversation around youth crime in Japan, leading to a more nuanced understanding of the complexities involved and a greater commitment to preventing such tragedies in the future. In mourning Junko Furuta, Japan was forced to confront its own societal challenges and the need for change. Her death was not in vain. It sparked a movement toward greater awareness, stronger legal protections, and a more vigilant society. Yet, the sadness and outrage that her story evoked remain a poignant reminder of the work that still needs to be done to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. Junko Furuta's story, though marked by unspeakable tragedy, has left a legacy that continues to resonate deeply within Japan and beyond. Her life, cruelly taken in its prime, has become a symbol of innocence lost and a stark reminder of the need for justice and protection for the most vulnerable in society. Today, Junko is remembered not just for the horror she endured, but for the impact her story has had on a nation's conscience and its ongoing efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Paying tribute to Junko's memory, many have sought to ensure that she is not forgotten. Her name has been etched into the cultural consciousness of Japan, often invoked in discussions about youth violence, legal reform, and the rights of victims. The details of her case have been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, all aiming to preserve the memory of her life and the lessons her tragic story imparts. These retellings, while difficult to confront, serve as a powerful reminder of the consequences of societal indifference and the importance of vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Public memorials and tributes to Junko have also been established, both official and unofficial, as a way for people to honor her memory and express their sorrow for what she endured. In the years following her death, several memorials have been created where people come to pay their respects, leaving flowers, letters, and prayers. These sites of remembrance serve as a testament to the enduring impact of her story and the deep empathy that her suffering has evoked. Junko's legacy has also inspired advocacy efforts aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Her story has become a rallying cry for those seeking to reform the legal system, particularly in the area of juvenile justice. Advocacy groups, often driven by the outrage and sorrow that Junko's case stirred, have pushed for stricter penalties for violent crimes and better protection for victims. These groups have also worked to raise awareness about the issues of bullying, peer pressure, and the exploitation of vulnerable youth, all of which played a role in the circumstances that led to Junko's death. In schools and communities, educational programs have been implemented that focus on the prevention of violence and the importance of standing up against abuse. Junko's story is often used as a powerful example in these programs, teaching young people about the devastating impact of violence and the importance of empathy, compassion, and courage in the face of wrongdoing. Her legacy has become a tool for education and a beacon of hope for a future where such tragedies are less likely to occur. Ongoing efforts to remember Junko Furuta and prevent similar tragedies continue to this day. Her story is a constant reminder of the need for vigilance, justice, and compassion in a world where darkness can sometimes prevail. The advocacy, education, and legal reforms that her case has inspired are part of a broader movement to ensure that her suffering was not in vain and that her memory continues to inspire positive change. In remembering Junko Furuta, we honor not only her life, but the lessons her tragic death has taught us. Her legacy is a call to action, a reminder that we must always strive to protect the innocent, to seek justice for the wronged, and to never forget the cost of silence and inaction. Though she was taken far too soon, Junko's memory lives on, serving as a beacon of light in the ongoing struggle against violence and cruelty. As we reach the conclusion of Junko Furuta's tragic story, the haunting echoes of her ordeal linger, reminding us of the profound impact her case has had on Japan and the world. The brutality she endured, the injustice she faced, and the failings of those who could have protected her all serve as a stark reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature. Yet within this darkness, Junko's story also shines a light on the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of memory. The lasting impact of Junko Furuta's case is undeniable. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about its society, its legal system, and its collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. The lessons learned from her ordeal are as relevant today as they were in the immediate aftermath of her death. Her story underscores the critical importance of a legal system that balances justice with compassion, a society that prioritizes the safety and well being of its citizens, and the need for individuals to speak out against violence and injustice, no matter the cost. Junko's legacy is a call to action, a reminder that silence and inaction in the face of cruelty are as damning as the acts themselves. Her story continues to resonate because it speaks to the universal struggle against evil, the fight for justice, and the enduring need to remember those who have suffered. By remembering Junko, we ensure that her life, though tragically cut short, continues to make a difference in the world. We honor her memory by striving to create a society where such horrors are less likely to occur and where justice is not a privilege, but a guarantee for all. As we reflect on Junko Furuta's story, we are left with a powerful, haunting message. The true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members, and the true measure of justice is how it responds to their suffering. Junko's story is a testament to the importance of vigilance, empathy, and courage in the face of darkness. It is a reminder that we must never forget the victims of violence, that we must always speak out against injustice, and that we must continue to strive for a world where no one has to endure what Junko did. In remembering Junko Furuta, we do more than just honor her memory. We reaffirm our commitment to justice, to compassion, and to the belief that every life, no matter how briefly lived, has the power to change the world. Her story, though filled with sorrow, is also filled with lessons that continue to guide us. It is a story that demands to be told, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon of hope in the ongoing fight against violence and cruelty. And so, as we close this chapter, we carry with us the haunting echoes of Junko Furuta's tragedy, resolved to ensure that her suffering was not in vain and that her legacy will continue to inspire a better, more just world.